Hello, welcome everybody. This is Mr. Page. I'm going to go through the various agents of evolution with you, so we don't have to go over it in class. So what we're going to be looking at here are various ways that allele frequencies can get messed up, which essentially is evolution. A change in allele frequency over time is the simplest definition of evolution that you can possibly have. Throughout this video, or throughout this PowerPoint, there are little links out, such as this. This is a neat little video dealing with evolution in action, evolution happening with these fence lizards and fire ants that can kill them. And I'm not going to go through those with you just for time's sake, because it's going to take a little bit to get to the PowerPoint. But I strongly urge you to go to Moodle, grab the PowerPoint, and watch these videos on your own. So there's 5 main agents to evolutionary change, and Charles Darwin researched the first one extensively, called natural selection. Now, this is what young Charles Darwin looked like, probably right before or right after his voyage on the Beagle, where he went out and essentially was adventuring around the world, looking at various wildlife, and was the ship's naturalist. He is not the only one to think of natural selection, though. Alfred Russel Wallace, who is little known, but came up with natural selection on his own at the same time period, totally separate from Darwin. He was doing an expedition out in the Amazon, Alfred Russel Wallace was. If you want to know his story in class, just ask me. I'll be happy to share his story with you. It's a pretty incredible story. But anyway, Darwin, who was a man of the cloth at one time early in his career. He was going to be a surgeon. Actually, earlier than that, he was going to be a surgeon. His father was a surgeon, but when he saw the first surgery and all the blood, Darwin could not stomach being a surgeon and a doctor. So he went in to be a man of the clergy, where he got to spend a lot of time walking around, observing the world, and that really got him interested in being a naturalist. And not with his father's approval, he went on the voyage of the Beagle. Went on the Beagle as a naturalist, as it was stopping in various ports in South America and the Galapagos and all those places. So, what Darwin ended up thinking when he came back and looking at all the specimens that he had come back is that, indeed, populations could change over time, and they change over time. And, the definition or the words here, population can change over time when individuals differ in one or more heritable traits that are responsible for differences in survival and reproduction. And so Darwin started to think about that, and looking at all the variety of life on these islands that he was on, and started to kind of think about how this could be. Now, once again, Darwin doesn't know anything about genetics. Mendel, around this time, is doing his work with the peas, and actually Darwin calls the genetic material gemmules, because he didn't know what the heck to call it, but he knew, and that was a big flaw in his thinking, or in Darwin's thought process, and that he thought, at least, he could explain it, but he actually didn't know how these traits were passed on from one generation to the next. And so he realized that was his big stumbling block in coming up with this theory. And so now with our advancements in technology and DNA, we can actually look at evolution at the DNA scale, which is actually incredible, and it all falls in line with what Darwin said back in the 1800s. So this was a little outcrop of islands off South America, the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. And this is where the famous Galapagos Islands are not too pretty when you go to them. Actually, they're pretty desolate, not much going on them. But this is where he did a lot of his research, collecting specimens, and this is where the famous Darwin finches come from, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. And so he observed all these different birds on these different islands and started to come up with the idea. Well, initially he thought they were all the same species, possibly, but when he started looking back at the lab after he came back to England, he realized that they were not the same bird. They were very, very different. And he learned that there was about 13 different varieties he discovered there. And so he started to attempt to correlate the variations in the environment with their beak size and their size, and he found out there was a pattern of wet years and dry years on the island, and that influenced which animal, or it influenced the beak size. So he thought, well, it's influencing their chance of survival. And so, came kind of his first idea, one of his first ideas of this idea of natural selection. So I encourage you here to watch this video if you download the PowerPoint. So the Galapagos finches now, there's one ancestral finch probably on the mainland in South America, blown out to the Galapagos in a storm. It happens quite often with islands off coasts. And those few birds that make it to the islands, or a couple birds that make it to the island, they over the generations adapt to that environment and go to different islands. And if you go to a different island and you don't have the right beak, you die. If you do have the right beak, you're gonna survive, and depending on your beak shape, you have a greater chance of survival, or maybe a less of a chance of survival. The evolution is still occurring on these islands today. There's been about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, they discovered a vampire finch. It's a really cool bird. It pecks on other birds and causes them to bleed. It drinks their blood. Particularly does that in times of drought. These birds are still coming up with unique behaviors and unique morphological differences. So what Darwin thought, with natural selection, in a nutshell, is that animals have way too many babies that can possibly survive, and that every individual has a little bit difference in it, and has some variations. Some of these variations are very good for survival. Some of them are not so good. And so what nature does is nature selects out the winners from the losers. It selects out the ones that are best adapted to that environment. And you can see here with these little snails, for whatever reason, the darker ones seem to survive more often. Maybe they blend in more with their surroundings. And as long as they can reproduce, in the next generation, you're going to have more darker colored snails versus the lighter colors. But the key is that you have variation, and over time, you're going to get the species to change. So here's the last part of it, natural selection. So only the darker ones survived, and the variation is inherited. That's a key point of natural selection. Variation has to be inherited. If it's not inherited, it ends there. So there is a difference in the survival and reproductive success of different phenotypes. And some are darker, some are lighter, some win, some lose. Natural selection acts directly on the phenotype. So what you can see with that organism, and therefore indirectly on the genotypes. And Darwin actually knew of artificial selection. He was in animal husbandry, crop plant breeding. Actually, the great book on Origin of Species, you think, oh wow, he's going to start off with a fantastic example for this groundbreaking biological book. He starts off with pigeons. He starts off with pigeons because Darwin was very familiar with the artificial breeding of pigeons. In fact, that Darwin did that. He went ahead and he bred pigeons. He got the different plumages and stuff, and so he had an idea that you could select out, based off of the different variations, that people can artificially do this. All he was proposing is that nature can do it too. Nature can do the same thing as humans do with artificial selection, but it's going to happen on a much slower scale. So there's various types of natural selection. You can see here disruptive selection, where the one that's in this medium. So here we have number of individuals and small individuals and large individuals. For whatever reason, the ones that are medium sized get taken away, so leaving relatively small ones and relatively large ones. There can be stabilizing selection, where both the extremes are eliminated, so the smalls and the large, so the mid-size are favored. Or there can be directional selection, where maybe the very large ones or the very small ones are selected for. So it can go either way. So that's, if you want to click through this animation, these are the three modes of natural selection: the disruptive, stabilizing, and directional that we just talked about. And goes through an example with some various finches. Another great example of artificial selection is the peppered moth example in England. You can watch the story, the kind of the data here, but I'll just kind of tell you the story. There's two different colored moths. There's one right here. This is the peppered variety, and the Carbonia variety, or the carbon variety. And so in England, they had at one time, not very many factories. Industrial revolution takes hold. Lots of factories being laid, lots of pollution going into the air. Before the factory started up, the peppered was the most seen in the environment. And so we'll blend in here in the background. This is lichen on the bark of the tree. And so it can blend in very well with that lichen. So as these factories started to emit soot and change the environment over the 10, 20 years, the lichen started to die off. It started to look more like the bottom picture. Well, if the lichen dies off, these peppered moths, the peppered colored ones, are going to be very easily seen on that black background. And so therefore, the predator, the bird, is going to eat them more likely. So originally, if you think of it, before factories, you have some variation in the population. Once in a while, we'll get a black one. It'll land on the lichen and be very prevalent, be very easy to be seen, and get eaten by the bird. When the factories start to take hold, start to emit all their pollution, the lichen dies, and the peppered ones, if they were to land on the bark there on the bottom, they would very easily be seen. So they'd be spotted by the bird and eaten. So what's happening here is that man is influencing the environment and causing one trait that was once bad to have, being dark, to actually become good to have. And so they actually put in some laws to clean up the environment. People noticed that they were causing harm to the environment. The lichen started to come back, and the population started to shift back to the peppered variety. So which of the following was a selective force for the moths? Is it the factories, pollution, lichens, birds, or trees? What do you think? It is the birds. The birds are the selective force. They're the selective force because they're the things that are selecting out the, quote, winners and losers of either being peppered or being dark. So the 5 agents, that first one, natural selection, it can drive a population to make one trait, quote, better than another, which is dependent, of course, on the environmental and selective forces in that environment. So you can see here this bird eating this solid beetle. All these other ones aren't seen. So another one is gene flow. And this can change the, we're just looking at what can you do to change the allele frequency in the population. This one can disrupt the population by either removing genes or adding genes to a population. And if you do that, you change the alleles in the population, right? So bring in new individuals or take out individuals, you're going to change the frequency of those various alleles that individual is carrying with them. You're also going to have genetic drift. And these are just random changes in the allele frequency that are very pronounced in small populations. So this could be some allele just dying out for some reason here. We have that green variety in some allele frequency. Man comes in, smashes them, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, the green ones are all of a sudden missing. There's not very many of them. So that allele frequency changed very quickly. So it's just a random change in that allele, in the allele frequency in that population. More pronounced in small populations because small populations don't have very many alleles. So if you eliminate some alleles, you're going to shift that allele frequency by quite a lot. That's what the math would say. Genetic drift includes founder effect. This is where you get, if you have a whole bunch of individuals, so think back to Darwin's finches, have a whole bunch of finches on the mainland, only a small fraction of them make it out to the islands of the Galapagos, and so the genetic diversity there on that colony is very, very low, because only a few individuals make up that colony. Also, bottlenecking effect. Up there is a greater prairie chicken. Usually a majority of the genotypes are prevented from participating in the next generation. Typically it's done by us. So we came through here in the state of Illinois, got rid of a lot of the natural habitat for the greater prairie chicken. And so it is considered a threatened species now. Was endangered at one time. People have looked at introducing prairie chickens from various states back into Illinois, so having some gene flow there. But the Illinois population is a very unique one genetically, and it's very different from the others. So there's a kind of a controversy going on. Should people bring in, should genes be, have gene flow come in to try to save this unique population, but you're gonna get rid of those traits when you're mating them from birds from another state. But anyway, what we did to our Illinois prairie chickens initially was a bottlenecking effect. We had a large amount of them, and then all of a sudden we essentially killed a whole bunch of them by destroying the habitat, so there was a very few number left. Mutations can also add variety to a population, and so just random changes in the DNA can of course make a new allele. So you see here we have this guy right here, these are all green, parents were green, but a random mutation makes this individual brown. And that can, of course, influence, or help, that can be influenced by natural selection as well. Mate selection or non-random mating, if you think about it, organisms a lot of times will select a mate. Humans select mates. And so this, by doing this, only specific phenotypes and therefore genotypes are going to be allowed to thrive in a population. So a lot of mate selection with birds, obviously. If you ask me about the birds of paradise, I'll show you all sorts of cool mating dances and such that the birds of paradise do. So if we look at it here, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which we'll be talking about later on, says that there has to be random mating, no migrations, genetic drift, mutations, or natural selection. If none of that occurs, the population won't change. If we have purple individuals, only seeking purple individuals here with non-random mating, you see the purples increase in frequency. The allele frequency changes, it's evolution. We have migration, so the pinks and the purples leave. The allele frequency changes. That's evolution. If we have genetic drift, so we have some of them are restricted for some reason, and therefore the new subset has a different alleles. We have evolution. We have a mutation. So a green one turns to yellow, and all of a sudden we have a change in allele frequency, which is evolution. Natural selection. So here we have our ancestral population. The purples are no longer reproduced, they're infertile, and all of a sudden they go out. Once again, we have evolution. So the importance is, look at all this. So we have mutations occurring, which is also influenced by sexual reproduction, independent assortment, crossing over, all that stuff, switching of genes. That gives us our genotype. Our genotype is influenced by all sorts of different factors, which eventually give us our phenotype, which is selected on by various outside pressures, and then nature will select the favorable ones from the unfavorable ones. So a lot going on with evolution. Thanks. If you have any questions, make sure you ask your teacher. Have a good night.